Karen mocks an African-American man, but when she discovers it was Snoop Dogg, she is paralyzed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Los Angeles as Snoop Dogg sat in his private studio, surrounded by the familiar comfort of his musical equipment. Despite his worldwide fame and countless achievements, he had never lost touch with his roots or forgotten the struggles that shaped him. Today, however, was different. He had made an unusual decision to take public transportation home. The choice wasn't born of necessity, but of a desire to stay connected to the community that had supported him throughout his journey. His security team had protested, but Snoop knew the importance of remaining grounded, of remembering where he came from. He had just finished recording a powerful new track about unity and understanding, and something inside him yearned for a moment of quiet reflection among everyday people. As he boarded the bus wearing simple clothes that barely hinted at his status, the other passengers barely gave him a second glance. Some were too absorbed in their phones, others too tired from their long workdays to notice the celebrity in their midst. Snoop found a quiet spot near the back, settling into the worn seat with the practiced ease of someone who remembered countless, similar journeys from his past. The bus wound its way through the city streets, each stop adding to the tapestry of faces that made up Los Angeles. A young mother with 2 children, an elderly man carrying groceries, a group of teenagers sharing earbuds, all of them part of the daily rhythm of city life. Snoop observed them all, his mind wandering to the lyrics he had just recorded, words about breaking down barriers and finding common ground. At one of the stops, a woman boarded who seemed to carry herself with an air of entitled superiority. Her perfectly styled blonde hair, designer handbag, and meticulously applied makeup marked her as someone who rarely took public transportation. The other passengers instinctively sensed her disdain, shifting uncomfortably as she surveyed the bus with barely concealed contempt. The woman, who would soon become known to everyone present as a typical Karen, scanned the bus for a seat, her nose wrinkled slightly at her surroundings. Her eyes finally landed on Snoop Dogg, and something in her expression changed. It wasn't recognition, rather it was something more insidious, a look he had seen countless times before throughout his life. She made her way down the aisle, her heels clicking against the floor with deliberate precision. Several empty seats were available, yet she seemed drawn to the area where Snoop sat, as if compelled by some inner need to assert her perceived superiority. The air in the bus grew thick with tension as other passengers began to sense the brewing confrontation. Snoop remained still, his calm exterior masking years of experience dealing with prejudice. He continued looking out the window, observing the city he loved, the city that had shaped him into who he was today. His mind drifted to all the young people who looked up to him, who found strength in his music and his message of resilience. "Excuse me," the woman's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and demanding. "I don't think you're sitting properly. You're taking up too much space." The accusation was absurd. Snoop was sitting perfectly normally, occupying no more space than any other passenger. A few people nearby shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the situation for what it was. The woman's words carried the weight of countless similar confrontations, echoing with generations of prejudice, poorly disguised as concern for propriety. "Ma'am," Snoop responded quietly, his voice carrying the same smooth confidence that had made him a legend in the music industry. "There are plenty of other seats available." His response, measured and peaceful, seemed to only agitate her further. Her perfectly manicured hands clutched her designer bag tighter, and her voice rose slightly, drawing more attention from the other passengers. "Well, I want to sit here, and you're making everyone uncomfortable." The irony of her statement hung in the air. She was the only one creating discomfort. Several passengers exchanged knowing looks, some shaking their heads slightly, others watching with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Through it all, Snoop maintained his composure, his presence radiating a dignity that no amount of prejudice could diminish. As the bus continued its journey through the streets of Los Angeles, the confrontation was just beginning. The setting, sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, casting a dramatic backdrop to a scene that would soon become a powerful lesson in respect, dignity, and the strength found in responding to hatred with wisdom. The tension on the bus continued to build as Karen remained standing in the aisle, her presence casting a shadow over what had been a peaceful journey. Her perfectly arranged exterior couldn't mask the ugliness of her prejudice, which became more apparent with each passing moment. Other passengers watched the scene unfold, their own experiences with similar situations reflected in their concerned expressions. "I pay my taxes, I contribute to this city," she continued, her voice carrying a note of superiority that made several passengers wince. "I shouldn't have to feel unsafe on public transportation." Snoop Dogg shifted slightly in his seat, his eyes finally meeting hers directly. In that moment, the contrast between them couldn't have been more stark, her agitation against his serenity, her prejudice against his wisdom. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of experience, yet maintained a gentleness that surprised everyone listening. "Safety," he said softly, "has nothing to do with what you're feeling right now. We both know that." His words seemed to catch her off guard. Perhaps she had expected anger, had hoped for it even, anything to justify her prejudices. Instead, she found herself faced with a calm dignity that made her own behavior appear even more inappropriate. A young woman sitting nearby had begun recording the interaction on her phone, though discreetly. Others watched with a mixture of emotions, some angry at the woman's behavior, others impressed by Snoop's composure, and many reflecting on similar situations they had witnessed or experienced. "You don't know anything about me," Karen retorted, but her voice had lost some of its initial confidence. "You don't know what I've been through." "That's true," Snoop acknowledged, his response surprising her again. "And you don't know my story either. But here's the difference. I'm not judging you based on how you look. I'm responding to how you're acting right now, in this moment." The bus had stopped at a red light, and the evening sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the scene in a warm glow. In that moment, something shifted in the atmosphere. Several passengers nodded in agreement with Snoop's words, their silent support becoming palpable. "Let me tell you a story," Snoop continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a natural storyteller. "When I was young, my grandmother taught me something important. She said that every person you meet is fighting their own battles, carrying their own burdens. The real measure of character isn't in how we treat people who look like us or think like us. It's in how we treat everyone else." His words resonated through the bus, touching something deep within many of the passengers. Even those who had been pretending not to pay attention found themselves drawn into his narrative. Karen's expression began to shift, the certainty in her stance wavering slightly. "My grandmother also taught me that change doesn't come from meeting hatred with hatred. It comes from standing firm in your dignity, from refusing to let someone else's prejudice define who you are." As he spoke, the bus continued its journey through the city streets. Outside the windows, Los Angeles continued its daily rhythm. People of all backgrounds walking the same sidewalks, sharing the same spaces, their lives intertwined in countless ways. "So here's what I'm going to do," Snoop said, his voice still, calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "I'm going to offer you this seat next to me, not because your behavior deserves it, but because sometimes the best way to change someone's heart is to show them a kindness they haven't earned." The offer hung in the air, creating a moment of profound silence on the bus. Karen stood frozen, her carefully constructed worldview confronting a reality that didn't match her preconceptions. The other passengers watched, knowing they were witnessing something significant, a moment where hate had the potential to transform into understanding. The sun had almost set now, its last rays painting the sky in deep purples and blues. Through the windows of the bus, the city lights were beginning to twinkle, each one a reminder of the countless stories and lives that made up their shared community. In this ordinary setting, an extraordinary lesson in humanity was unfolding, its impact reaching far beyond the confines of that evening bus ride. The atmosphere in the bus shifted perceptibly as Karen stood there, facing Snoop's unexpected offer of kindness. Her perfectly manicured hands fidgeted with her designer bag, betraying an inner turmoil that her carefully composed face tried to hide. The other passengers held their breath, watching as the woman's worldview visibly collided with the reality before her. "I don't need your charity," she finally managed, but her voice had lost its earlier venom. The words seemed to come from a place of defensiveness rather than aggression now, as if she were trying to maintain the last fragments of her previously unshakable certainty. Snoop's response was measured, his voice carrying the wisdom of countless similar encounters. "This isn't charity, Mum. This is an opportunity for both of us. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to sit down and really see the person in front of you." A young student in the back of the bus had tears in her eyes, silently recording the interaction. An elderly man nodded slowly, his weathered face showing recognition of a truth he had learned through his own long life. The bus driver watched through the rearview mirror, his hands steady on the wheel as the vehicle continued its journey through the darkening city streets. "You don't understand," Karen continued, but something had changed in her tone. "You can't possibly know what it's like." She trailed off, seemingly uncertain how to finish that sentence without revealing the prejudices that lay beneath. "Try me," Snoop replied simply, gesturing to the empty seat beside him. "We've got time, and I'm a good listener." The bus turned onto Sunset Boulevard, the streetlights creating a gentle rhythm of light and shadow inside the vehicle. Each passing light seemed to illuminate different faces among the passengers, faces that showed a spectrum of emotions: hope, skepticism, curiosity, and something that looked like the beginning of understanding. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, Karen's rigid posture began to soften. The hand gripping her designer bag loosened slightly, and her eyes, which had been blazing with indignation, showed the first glimmers of uncertainty. She looked around the bus, perhaps for the first time really seeing the other passengers, not as background characters in her personal drama, but as real people with their own stories and struggles. She started, then stopped. For the first time since boarding the bus, she seemed at a loss for words. The carefully constructed facade she had worn like armor began to show cracks, revealing glimpses of something more vulnerable underneath. A baby's laugh from the front of the bus broke the tension momentarily. The sound, pure and unmarred by prejudice, seemed to underscore the absurdity of the situation. Several passengers smiled involuntarily, and even Karen's lips twitched slightly. "You know what the hardest part of change is?" Snoop asked, his voice gentle but carrying throughout the now quiet bus. "It's not admitting you were wrong. It's admitting that maybe, just maybe, you've been missing out on something important all this time." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The city continued to roll past the windows, each street corner and intersection, a reminder of the countless crossroads where people's lives intersected, where choices were made, and where transformation became possible. An older woman across the aisle spoke up, her voice soft but clear. "When I was young," she said, her accent hinting at a journey from distant shores, "someone showed me kindness when I least deserved it. It changed everything." She smiled at Karen, then at Snoop. "Sometimes we need to be brave enough to accept the kindness being offered." The bus stopped at another red light, and through the windows the lights of Los Angeles created a constellation of possibilities. Karen looked at the empty seat, then at Snoop, then at her own reflection in the darkened window. In that reflection, perhaps she saw something she hadn't noticed before, not just who she was, but who she could become. The moment stretched out, filled with potential. The other passengers watched, understanding that they were witnessing not just a confrontation reaching its conclusion, but possibly the beginning of something more significant, a small but meaningful change in the fabric of human understanding. With a hesitation that seemed to contradict her earlier confidence, Karen finally sat down. The simple act of taking that seat carried the weight of years of prejudice being questioned, of barriers beginning to crack. The other passengers tried to hide their surprise, but the collective intake of breath was audible in the quiet bus. "My name is Elizabeth," she said quietly, using her real name instead of the stereotype she had embodied moments before. I don't usually..." She struggled to find the words, her carefully constructed worldview shifting beneath her feet like sand. Snoop nodded encouragingly, understanding the difficulty of that moment. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones we need the most, he said. And you know what? That's okay. We all start somewhere. The bus continued its journey through Los Angeles, but the atmosphere inside had transformed. What had started as a scene of conflict had evolved into something else entirely, a moment of genuine human connection. Other passengers began to share their own stories, each one a thread in a larger tapestry of human experience. A middle-aged man spoke about growing up in the city, watching it change and grow. A young woman described her first experiences with prejudice as a child and how a kind stranger's intervention had given her hope. Through it all, Elizabeth listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time. I've spent my whole life believing certain things, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It was easier that way, safer, I thought, but sitting here now... She looked around the bus, meeting the eyes of other passengers. I'm starting to wonder what I've been missing. Snoop shared stories of his own journey, of the challenges he'd faced and overcome, of the people who had helped him along the way, and of those who had tried to stand in his path. But he spoke without bitterness, focusing instead on the power of resilience and the importance of maintaining one's dignity in the face of prejudice. As the bus approached another stop, a group of teenagers boarded, their laughter and energy filling the space. They immediately recognized Snoop, their excitement evident in their whispered conversations and pointed looks. But what caught their attention even more was the sight of him sitting and talking peacefully with Elizabeth, their animated discussion a visible demonstration of bridges being built. You see those kids? Snoop gestured subtly. They're watching us right now. They're learning something important, not from what we're saying, but from what we're doing. Every interaction we have is a chance to teach the next generation something about humanity. Elizabeth looked at the teenagers, then back at Snoop. I never thought about it that way, she admitted. I never thought about a lot of things, really. Her hands, which had been clutching her designer bag like a shield, finally relaxed. The conversation continued as the bus wound its way through the city streets. Other passengers contributed their own insights and experiences, turning what had started as a confrontation into an impromptu community dialogue. The young student who had been recording earlier had put away her phone, choosing instead to actively participate in the discussion. As the evening deepened, the lights of Los Angeles created a warm glow inside the bus. The city outside continued, its eternal dance of movement and life. But inside this moving sanctuary, something remarkable was taking place, the slow but steady dismantling of prejudice, one conversation at a time. The bus driver, who had been listening all along, smiled into his rearview mirror. In his many years behind the wheel, he had seen countless interactions between passengers, but few as transformative as this one. Tonight, his bus had become more than just a means of transportation. It had become a space for change, understanding, and growth. As the bus approached its final stops, the golden glow of street lamps illuminated faces that had been transformed by the evening's events. Elizabeth sat quietly, her designer bag now resting casually in her lap rather than clutched like a shield. The perfectly styled hair and immaculate makeup that had once seemed like armor now appeared softer in the evening light, humanized by the vulnerability she had shown. My stop is coming up, she said softly to Snoop, her voice carrying a weight of realization. I never thought... when I got on this bus tonight... She paused, searching for the right words. Thank you for not giving up on me when you had every right to. The other passengers, who had been part of this impromptu community for the past hour, watched with quiet appreciation. The young student who had initially recorded the confrontation raised her hand slightly. Can I say something? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Elizabeth turned to face her, and for the first time that evening really looked at the young woman without prejudice clouding her vision. The student stood, holding herself with quiet dignity. I've been in situations like this before, she said, but usually they end differently. Usually there's anger and hurt on both sides, and everyone walks away feeling worse. But tonight, she gestured around the bus. Tonight showed me that change is possible. Real change. Snoop nodded, his presence still radiating the same calm, wisdom that had diffused the initial confrontation. Sometimes, he said, the biggest journeys we take aren't the ones that move us through the city. They're the ones that move us through our own understanding. The bus driver, who had been a silent witness to the entire evening, spoke up from his seat. In 15 years of driving this route, I've seen a lot of things, but this, he shook his head, smiling, this is what hope looks like. As the bus slowed to Elizabeth's stop, she stood up, but her movements were different now. Gone was the entitled air she had carried when she first boarded. Instead, there was a thoughtfulness to her gestures, a new awareness of the space she shared with others. I have a weekly meeting downtown, she said, looking at Snoop and then at the other passengers. I usually take my car, but maybe I'll take this bus again if that's okay with everyone. The elderly woman who had spoken earlier smiled warmly. The journey is always better when we travel it together, she said, her accent wrapping the words in wisdom. Before stepping off the bus, Elizabeth turned one last time. I used to think I knew exactly who I was and what the world was like. Now I realize I've been looking through a very small window. Thank you, all of you, for helping me see a bigger picture. As she descended the steps, several passengers noticed tears in her eyes, not tears of anger or humiliation, but of transformation. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss, and through the windows they watched her walk away, her posture suggesting someone carrying new thoughts rather than old prejudices. Snoop's own stop was next. As he stood to leave, the other passengers broke into spontaneous applause, not for his celebrity status, but for the lesson in humanity he had taught them all. The teenagers who had boarded earlier asked for a quick photo, but not just with him. They wanted Elizabeth in it too, to capture the moment that had meant so much. Sometimes, Snoop said as he prepared to step off the bus, the most powerful thing we can do is choose understanding over anger, conversation over confrontation. Every person we meet is an opportunity to build a bridge or a wall. The choice is always ours. The bus driver caught his eye in the rearview mirror. You've given us all something to think about tonight, he said, something to carry forward. As Snoop stepped onto the street, the warm Los Angeles night embraced him. Through the bus windows, he could see the faces of people who had shared in something extraordinary, a reminder that even in the most unlikely moments, humanity has the capacity for growth and change. The bus pulled away, carrying its passengers back into the rhythm of city life. But they were different now, transformed by an evening that had begun with confrontation and ended with connection. As they continued their separate journeys, they carried with them the understanding that sometimes the most important destinations are not places on a map, but moments of truth in our hearts. The city lights twinkled overhead, each one a testament to the countless stories unfolding beneath them. And somewhere in Los Angeles, a woman named Elizabeth walked home, her steps lighter, her world larger, carrying the first pages of a new chapter in her life.